Alexander Moore's silver Bentley cruised along the winding road leading back to his estate. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in hues of twilight. A businessman of meticulous precision, Alexander had spent the past 3 days sealing an acquisition deal that would cement his legacy as one of the most astute entrepreneurs in Boston. He was exhausted but eager to return to the one person who mattered most, his 10-year-old son, Henry. The boy had been Alexander's anchor ever since Emma's tragic passing a decade earlier. She had died during childbirth, leaving Alexander to navigate a life he never anticipated, being both a father and mother. Despite the chasm Emma's absence left, Alexander dedicated himself to raising Henry with all the love he could muster. Though stern and reserved by nature, his soft spot for the boy was undeniable. The crackle of his car radio broke the silence as a weather alert announced a sudden storm front approaching. Rain began to lash against the windshield, visibility shrinking to mere feet. Alexander tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "Not tonight," he muttered, frustration threading through his voice. The accident happened in a blur. A truck barreling down the opposite lane lost control, its driver fighting to correct the skidding vehicle. Alexander swerved instinctively to avoid impact, his tires screeching against the slick asphalt. The Bentley veered off the road, plummeting into a shallow ravine and colliding with a tree. Inside the wreckage, Alexander was slumped against the deflating airbag, unconscious. A faint trickle of blood ran down his temple as the sound of approaching sirens echoed in the distance. At the Moore estate, Henry sat curled on the massive leather couch in the library, poring over one of his favorite adventure novels. The storm outside rattled the windows, but Henry was too engrossed to notice. His governess, Mrs. Edith, appeared in the doorway, her face lined with concern. "Master Henry," she began hesitantly. The phone call she had just received from the hospital played over and over in her mind. How could she tell the boy that his father might not return home tonight, or for a very long time? Henry looked up, his bright green eyes filled with curiosity. "What is it, Mrs. Edith? Is it about Dad?" Her hesitation was answer enough. A lump formed in Henry's throat as fear gripped him. "What happened? Is he okay?" Mrs. Edith's voice trembled. "There's been an accident. Your father. He's in the hospital." The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fireplace. Henry's book slid to the floor as tears welled in his eyes. "Is he going to be all right?" "I don't know," she whispered, stepping closer to envelop him in a hug. "But we want to be strong for him, okay?" As the storm raged on outside, Henry clung to the only comfort he had left, his heart aching with uncertainty. Upstairs, the estate seemed cavernous and cold, a reflection of the void Alexander's absence would soon leave behind. The sterile whiteness of the hospital room seemed to swallow Alexander more whole. Machines beeped steadily, tracking the faint rhythms of his life as he lay motionless, his face pale and bruised. The doctors had confirmed it. A severe head trauma had sent him into a coma. His prognosis was uncertain, the duration unpredictable. Back at the Moore estate, the atmosphere was heavy with unease. Henry sat quietly at the dining table, his usual lively demeanor dulled by worry. His untouched plate of scrambled eggs sat before him, growing cold. Across the table, Mrs. Edith, the family's aging governess, watched him with a mix of sadness and helplessness. "Master Henry, you must eat something," she urged gently, though her own appetite had long vanished. "I'm not hungry," he replied, his voice small. "What if Dad doesn't wake up?" Mrs. Edith's heart broke at the question. She had been with the family for decades, first serving as a nanny to Alexander himself when he was a boy. But now, at 74, her health had begun to waver. Arthritis plagued her hands, and her movements were slower than they used to be. She feared she was no longer capable of providing Henry with the attention he needed, especially now. That evening, she made the difficult decision to contact Alexander's attorney, Charles Whitmore, a man who had managed the Moore family's legal affairs for years. Over the phone, she expressed her concerns. Henry needs someone young, someone who can keep up with him. "I fear I am simply too old to handle this on my own," she admitted. Whitmore's response was immediate. "We'll find someone, Mrs. Edith. I'll see to it." The next morning, Charles Whitmore visited the hospital, speaking with the nurses and doctors who had been attending Alexander. Among them was Clara Davidson, a young nurse who had only recently joined the hospital staff. Clara was known for her unrelenting kindness and ability to connect with her patients, no matter how difficult the circumstances. She was 28, with a warmth that radiated from her like sunlight. Her light brown hair was often tied back in a simple ponytail, and her hazel eyes reflected an inner strength forged by years of hardship. Whitmore approached her as she was checking Alexander's vitals. "Miss Davidson, may I have a word?" She looked up, startled. "Of course," she said, stepping aside. Whitmore quickly explained the situation. A 10-year-old boy, now alone in a sprawling mansion, desperate for stability as his father lay comatose. "We need someone who can look after him temporarily, someone compassionate but firm, and someone we can trust implicitly." Clara hesitated, her hand brushing against the edge of the clipboard she held. "I've never worked as a caretaker before," she said honestly. "My experience is with patients, not children." Whitmore smiled faintly. "That boy doesn't need a nanny. He needs someone who could be a steady presence during an unimaginably difficult time. I've spoken with your supervisor, and she has nothing but praise for your character. Please, consider it." Clara bit her lip. The idea of stepping into a world so foreign to her, a world of wealth and privilege, was intimidating. Yet, she couldn't ignore the tug of her conscience. "When would I need to start?" she asked. "As soon as possible," Whitmore replied. The Moore estate loomed before Clara later that afternoon, its sheer size almost overwhelming. The sprawling brick mansion sat atop a hill, framed by manicured gardens and a long driveway. Clara's old hatchback looked woefully out of place among the luxury vehicles parked near the garage. As she stepped out of her car, her gaze swept over the grandeur before her. The mansion was unlike anything she had ever seen. She adjusted the strap of her worn leather bag on her shoulder, reminding herself to stay composed. Mrs. Edith greeted her at the door, her warm but tired eyes giving Clara an appraising look. "You must be Miss Davidson," she said, extending a slightly trembling hand. "Please call me Clara," she replied, shaking her hand firmly. Inside, the house was even more imposing. High ceilings, glittering chandeliers, and polished wooden floors created an atmosphere of quiet opulence. Clara couldn't help but feel out of place, her simple attire contrasting starkly with the luxury surrounding her. Henry peeked out from behind the banister of the grand staircase, his curious green eyes meeting Clara's. She smiled at him, but the boy quickly darted back upstairs, disappearing into the shadows. "Don't take it personally," Mrs. Edith said with a soft sigh. "He's been very withdrawn since the accident." "I understand," Clara replied. "I'll give him time." Over the next few hours, Clara settled into the guest quarters, which were larger than her entire apartment. Mrs. Edith showed her around, explaining the daily routines and introducing her to the household staff. Not everyone was as welcoming as the governess. In the kitchen, Mary, the cook, raised an eyebrow at Clara's arrival. "So, this is the nurse they've brought in," she muttered under her breath to another staff member. Clara caught snippets of the conversation as she passed by. "Doesn't look like she belongs here," someone whispered. That evening, as Clara sat alone in the guest quarters, she reflected on the challenge ahead. Henry needed her, but the unspoken judgment from the staff and the weight of stepping into a life so far removed from her own made her feel like an imposter. Still, she resolved to do her best. For Henry's sake, she couldn't fail. The next morning, Clara awoke early to the unfamiliar sounds of the mansion stirring to life. Outside her window, gardeners trimmed hedges while a delivery van rumbled up the long driveway. Though she felt the weight of her new responsibility, she brushed it aside and prepared herself for the day. She found Henry sitting in the library, surrounded by towering shelves of books. He was cross-legged on the floor, building something with Legos, his expression focused but somber. Clara hesitated at the door, unsure how to approach him without intruding. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice warm but cautious. Henry looked up briefly, then returned his attention to the bricks in his hands. "Morning," he mumbled. Clara stepped inside and crouched a few feet away. "What are you building?" "A ship," he said curtly, not looking at her. She tilted her head, studying the half-formed creation. "Looks pretty impressive already. Is it from a movie?" "No, it's mine." Clara smiled. "Original design, huh? That's even better." He didn't reply, but the faintest flicker of interest crossed his face before he turned his attention back to his project. As the day wore on, Clara attempted to make herself useful. She joined Henry for lunch, where he mostly picked at his food, and followed Mrs. Edith's suggestions on structuring his time. The boy was polite but distant, a wall of guardedness shielding his young heart. Clara couldn't blame him. His father was the cornerstone of his world, and now that foundation was gone, her challenges extended beyond Henry. The household staff, while professional, treated Clara with thinly veiled skepticism. Their mistrust was subtle, expressed in fleeting glances and hushed conversations that trailed off when she entered a room. Among the staff, Beatrice stood out. She arrived that afternoon, her presence announced by the click of designer heels on the marble foyer. Beatrice Hastings was a tall, striking woman in her mid-30s, her blonde hair perfectly styled, and her figure wrapped in a tailored cream-colored dress. She carried an air of entitlement that filled the room like perfume. "Mrs. Edith," she called as she swept into the house, her tone sharp and commanding. Mrs. Edith appeared from the sitting room, her expression tight. "Miss Hastings, I didn't realize you were coming by." "Of course I am," Beatrice replied, her voice dripping with feigned concern. "Poor Alexander is in such a terrible state, and little Henry, well, someone has to make sure he's cared for properly." Her gaze shifted to Clara, her perfectly arched eyebrow lifting in disdain. "And you must be the nurse." Clara extended a hand, determined to stay cordial. "Clara Davidson. It's nice to meet you." Beatrice barely glanced at the offered hand before turning her attention back to Mrs. Edith. "I wasn't aware the family was hiring strangers to handle such delicate matters." Mrs. Edith stiffened. "Miss Davidson is here to assist until Mr. Moore's condition improves. She has been a tremendous help already." Beatrice gave a dismissive "I see." She turned to Clara, her eyes cold and calculating. "Well, I'm sure you'll do your best. Though it must be quite overwhelming for someone like you, stepping into a place like this." Clara held her ground. "It is a big adjustment, but my priority is making sure Henry feels supported during this time." Beatrice's lips curved into a thin smile, but her eyes remained sharp. How noble. Over the next few days, Beatrice made her presence felt in the household. She hovered over Henry with a performative sweetness that made Clara's stomach churn. "Oh, Henry," Beatrice cooed one afternoon as she sat beside him in the drawing room. "I brought you some new toys. You'll love them." She produced an expensive-looking set of action figures from a glossy bag. Henry took them with a muttered thanks, but his enthusiasm was lukewarm. Beatrice's exaggerated gestures and syrupy tone fell hollow compared to Clara's quiet, genuine kindness. Meanwhile, Beatrice didn't hide her disdain for Clara. She criticized her at every opportunity, often in backhanded ways. Poor Alexander always had such high standards for his staff. She remarked one evening as Clara helped Mrs. Edith clear the dining table. "I'm sure he would have wanted someone with more experience." Clara forced a polite smile, refusing to take the bait. "My focus is on making sure Henry is cared for, Miss Hastings. I'm doing everything I can to honor Mr. Moore's trust." Beatrice's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Well, let's hope that's enough." Though the tension in the house grew, Clara's bond with Henry began to strengthen. She respected his need for space, but found small ways to connect. She joined him for quiet reading sessions in the library and introduced him to games from her childhood. One evening, as they played a simple card game by the fire, Henry looked up suddenly. "Why did you come here?" he asked. Clara set her cards down, meeting his gaze. "Because someone told me you needed help, and I wanted to be here for you." Henry studied her face, as if searching for cracks in her sincerity. Finding none, he nodded slowly and returned to his cards. For the first time since her arrival, Clara felt a glimmer of hope. The days stretched into weeks, and life at the Moore estate began to find a fragile rhythm. Clara, though still an outsider to some, became a constant presence in Henry's world. She approached her time with him cautiously, never pushing too hard, but she always found ways to make him feel seen. One rainy afternoon, she found Henry in the mansion's sunroom, staring out at the gardens through the glass panes streaked with raindrops. His shoulders were slumped, and his face held an expression far too heavy for a 10-year-old. "Hey there," Clara said softly as she entered, holding 2 steaming mugs of cocoa. "Thought you might like this." Henry glanced at her, then at the mug, before muttering a quiet thanks. He accepted it, his fingers curling around the warmth of the ceramic. Clara took a seat across from him, sipping her own cocoa in silence. "Do you miss him?" Henry asked suddenly, his voice almost a whisper. Clara blinked, caught off guard. "Your dad?" He nodded, his gaze fixed on the rain. "Every day," she replied honestly. "I haven't known him as long as you have, but I can tell he's an incredible man. I see in the way everyone talks about him, especially you." Henry hesitated, then looked at her. What if he doesn't wake up? The raw vulnerability in his voice made Clara's heart ache. She set her mug down and leaned forward. "Henry, I know it's scary. It's okay to feel scared, but your dad is strong, and he's fighting to come back to you. In the meantime, it's okay for us to miss him and to feel sad. It doesn't mean we're giving up on him." Henry's lip quivered, and for a moment, Clara thought he might cry, but he quickly blinked the tears away and took a sip of his cocoa. "Do you think he'd like you?" he asked after a pause. Clara smiled softly. "I hope so. But what matters most to me is that you like me." For the first time since her arrival, Henry gave her a small, tentative smile. Clara's patience and kindness began to break through Henry's guardedness. She found ways to distract him from his worries, introducing him to simple joys he had long ignored. One sunny morning, she coaxed him outside to the garden, armed with packets of seeds and a pair of small shovels. Henry was skeptical at first. "Why are we planting stuff?" he asked, frowning at the dirt. "Because it's fun," Clara replied. "And because sometimes when life feels tough, planting something and watching it grow reminds us that good things can still happen." Henry tilted his head, considering this. "What if they don't grow?" "They will," Clara said confidently. "But if they don't, we'll try again. Deal?" Reluctantly, Henry nodded. As they worked together, digging small holes and covering the seeds with soil, he began to open up. He told her about the books he loved, the games he used to play with his dad, and his favorite memories of trips to the coast. For the first time in weeks, his laughter filled the air. Not everyone was pleased with Clara's growing bond with Henry. Beatrice watched from the drawing room window, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had been hovering around his estate more frequently, her presence a constant reminder of her self-serving motives. She noticed the way Henry's demeanor brightened around Clara and the ease with which the nurse had integrated herself into his life. "This is unacceptable," Beatrice muttered to herself. She cornered Mary, the cook, in the kitchen later that afternoon. "It's absurd, isn't it?" Beatrice began, her voice dripping with disdain. "That woman, pretending she belongs here. The Moores are a prestigious family, not a charity case." Mary glanced at Beatrice uneasily. "Well, Henry does seem happier with her around." Beatrice waved a dismissive hand. "Children are impressionable. They'll latch on to anyone who gives them attention. It doesn't mean she's right for him, or for this family." Her icy tone silenced any further objections. Beatrice was determined to regain control. One evening, Clara found Henry sitting in the library again, but this time, he wasn't alone. Beatrice perched on the arm of a chair nearby, her polished nails tapping rhythmically against a book's leather cover. "There you are," Clara said brightly, stepping inside. "I was just about to start dinner." "Do you want to help me, Henry?" Beatrice's smile was razor-thin. "We were just having a little chat, weren't we, Henry?" The boy glanced between them, unsure of what to say. "Yeah, I guess." Clara noticed the slight tension in his posture and decided to tread carefully. "Well, I could really use your expertise in the kitchen. You're the only one who knows where the chocolate chips are for cookies." Henry's face lit up at the mention of cookies. He slid off his chair and walked toward Clara. "Cookies," Beatrice said, her tone saccharine. "How quaint. Don't let him eat too many, Clara. You wouldn't want to spoil his appetite." Clara's smile didn't falter. "Don't worry, we'll save some for everyone." As Henry followed her out of the room, Clara couldn't help but feel Beatrice's icy stare boring into her back. In the kitchen, as they mixed dough and spilled flour across the counter, Henry burst into giggles. Clara pretended to be horrified when he flung a small handful of flour at her, and soon they were laughing so hard they could barely stand. For a moment, the mansion didn't feel so cold and vast. For a moment, Henry didn't feel so alone. Beatrice had always been adept at manipulation. She wore her charm like armor, dazzling those she sought to control while obscuring her true intentions. But Clara's growing influence over Henry was a threat Beatrice could no longer ignore. For weeks, she had observed the nurse carving out a place in the boy's heart, and the sight of Henry laughing with her at the dinner table or seeking her out for comfort ignited a deep resentment in Beatrice. That evening, Beatrice found her opportunity. She caught Henry alone in the music room, where he was absently plunking out a melody on the grand piano. "Henry, darling," she cooed, stepping inside. "You're becoming quite the little musician." Henry looked up, his expression neutral. "Dad taught me a few things. I'm not that good." "Oh, nonsense," Beatrice said, lowering herself gracefully onto the bench beside him. "I'm sure your father is very proud of you. He always wants the best for you, you know." Henry nodded, but didn't respond. Beatrice's tone softened, taking on a conspiratorial edge. "Speaking of what's best, I've been meaning to talk to you about Clara." Henry's fingers paused on the keys. "What about her?" "Well," Beatrice began, her voice dripping with faux concern, "I'm just worried. She seems so eager to be here. Don't you think that's strange? She doesn't really belong in a place like this." Henry frowned. "She's nice. She helps me." "Of course, darling," Beatrice said quickly. "I'm sure she means well. But you have to wonder, why would someone like her, someone who doesn't know your family, suddenly want to stay in a mansion and take care of a boy she just met? Maybe it's because she wants something." Henry's jaw tightened. "That's not true. She likes being here." Beatrice leaned in slightly, her voice lowering. "Sometimes people pretend to care because they want something in return. Money, power, a better life. I'd hate to see you or your father taken advantage of." Henry pulled his hands back from the piano, his expression clouding with doubt. "She's not like that," he said, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. "Of course not," Beatrice said smoothly, brushing a strand of blonde hair over her shoulder. "I just want you to be careful, sweetheart. You're such a smart boy. I know you'll figure out who truly has your best interests at heart." With that, she rose and left the room, leaving Henry alone with her words echoing in his mind. The next day, Clara noticed a shift in Henry's behavior. He was quieter, more reserved, and less eager to engage in their usual activities. When she suggested planting flowers in the garden, he shrugged and said he didn't feel like it. At lunch, he barely touched his food, mumbling that he wasn't hungry. "Is everything okay?" Clara asked gently, kneeling beside him as he sat on the edge of the library couch. "I'm fine," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. Clara frowned, sensing something was wrong. "Henry, if something's bothering you, you can tell me. You know that, right?" Henry hesitated, then looked at her with a flicker of uncertainty. "Why did you come here?" The question caught Clara off guard. "What do you mean? Like, why did you really come? Was it just for the money?" Clara's heart sank. "Henry, I came because I wanted to help. When I heard about what happened to your dad, I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. I know how hard it is to feel like you're alone, and I didn't want you to feel that way." Henry studied her for a long moment, then lowered his eyes. "Okay," he said quietly, but his tone was tinged with doubt. Clara felt a pang of hurt, but decided not to press him further. Later that evening, Clara overheard a conversation in the hallway as she passed by the sitting room. Beatrice's sharp, lilting voice cut through the air. "She's sweet-talking him. That's what she's doing," Beatrice said to Mary, the cook. "It's all part of her game. She's trying to weasel her way into this family, and once Alexander wakes up, if he wakes up, she'll find a way to cling to him, too. Mark my words." Clara froze, her blood boiling. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, her gaze locked on Beatrice. "I'd appreciate it if you didn't speak about me behind my back," Clara said, her voice steady but firm. Beatrice turned, her expression one of mock surprise. "Oh, Clara, dear, I didn't see you there. I was just expressing some concerns. If you have concerns, you can bring them to me directly," Clara replied. "But I won't stand by and let you spread lies about me." Beatrice smirked, her eyes gleaming with malice. "Lies? Oh, sweetheart, I don't need to lie. People like you always reveal their true colors eventually." Clara clenched her fists but refused to rise to the bait. "My only priority is Henry's well-being. If you have a problem with that, take it up with Mr. Moore when he wakes up." Beatrice's smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered. "Oh, don't worry. I intend to." That night, as Clara lay awake in her room, she resolved not to let Beatrice's schemes shake her resolve. Henry needed her now more than ever, and she wouldn't let anyone, especially not someone as self-serving as Beatrice, undermine the bond they were building. But in the quiet of the night, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the battle for Henry's trust was only just beginning. Tension in the Moore mansion had reached a boiling point. Beatrice's whispers and insinuations, coupled with her growing influence over the household staff, created an undercurrent of distrust that Clara could feel everywhere she went. It was subtle but undeniable. The sideways glances, the abrupt silences when she entered a room, the way even Mrs. Edith seemed reluctant to meet her eyes. For Henry, the confusion planted by Beatrice lingered like a shadow. He began pulling away from Clara, retreating into himself. Gone were their shared moments of laughter in the kitchen or the garden. Instead, he spent long hours alone in his room or with his nose buried in books, avoiding her gaze whenever she tried to reach out. One afternoon, Clara decided to confront the source of the problem head-on. She found Beatrice in the sitting room, reclining on one of the antique sofas with a glass of white wine in hand, her phone in the other. The sight of her lounging so comfortably in Alexander's home, as though she already owned it, set Clara's teeth on edge. "We need to talk," Clara said firmly, standing in the doorway. Beatrice didn't look up from her phone. "Oh, Clara, you sound so serious. Is something wrong?" "You know exactly what's wrong," Clara said, stepping into the room. "Whatever you're telling Henry about me, whatever lies you're spreading to the staff, it needs to stop." Beatrice finally set her phone down, her icy blue eyes locking onto Clara with a predator's precision. "Lies. My dear, I'm simply looking out for the best interests of this family. It's not my fault if people are starting to see through your act." Clara crossed her arms, her voice unwavering. "There's no act. I came here to help Henry during one of the hardest times of his life. That's all I care about." Beatrice rose slowly from the sofa, her movements deliberate. She was taller than Clara, and she used her height to loom over her. "Let me be very clear, Clara. This isn't your place. You don't belong here. You're a temporary solution at best, and once Alexander wakes up, if he wakes up, you'll be gone. So why don't you save us all the trouble and leave now?" Clara held her ground, her hands clenched at her sides. "I'm not going anywhere. Henry needs stability, and I won't abandon him just because you've decided I don't fit into your plans." Beatrice's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Oh, sweetie, you have no idea what my plans are." The following day, Beatrice escalated her campaign. She approached Charles Whitmore, the Moore family's attorney, during one of his visits to the estate. "Charles," she said, her voice tinged with urgency, "we need to talk about Clara Davidson. Whitmore raised an eyebrow. What about her? Beatrice sighed dramatically. I've been keeping an eye on her, and I have to say, I'm concerned. She's completely out of her depth here. I've heard from some of the staff that she's been neglecting her duties. Neglecting? Whitmore asked, clearly skeptical. From what I've seen, she's been attentive to Henry and respectful of the household. Well, you don't live here, Beatrice countered, her voice sharpening. You don't see how she's constantly overstepping, trying to insert herself into matters that don't concern her. I wouldn't be surprised if she's trying to ingratiate herself with the family for personal gain. Honestly, Charles, for Henry's sake, we should consider having her removed. Whitmore frowned, leaning back in his chair. That's a serious accusation. Do you have any actual evidence? Beatrice's face tightened, but she quickly masked her irritation. No hard evidence, of course. But you know how people like her operate, always looking for an angle. I just think we need to protect the family's interests. Whitmore stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'll look into it, he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. That evening, Clara was summoned to the study where Whitmore waited. She walked in, her pulse quickening at the sight of the stern-faced attorney sitting behind Alexander's desk. Miss Davidson, he began, gesturing for her to sit. I've been hearing some concerns about your role here. Clara sat down, her back straight. Concerns from whom? Whitmore hesitated, then said, Beatrice Hastings, primarily. She's raised some questions about your intentions and your ability to handle this position. Clara's chest tightened. My intentions are clear, Mr. Whitmore. I'm here to help Henry during a very difficult time. If anyone has doubts about that, I'd like the chance to address them directly. Whitmore studied her for a moment, his expression softening. To be honest, Clara, I've seen nothing but dedication from you. But the truth is, Beatrice holds significant sway in this household, and if she continues to push for your removal, I may not have the authority to prevent it. Clara swallowed hard, her voice steady despite the knot in her throat. If she wants to get rid of me, she'll have to prove I'm not doing my job. Until then, I'm staying. Whitmore nodded, a hint of admiration flickering in his eyes. Fair enough. Just be careful, Miss Davidson. Beatrice isn't someone to underestimate. That night, Clara found herself sitting alone in the garden under a canopy of stars. The mansion loomed behind her, its grandeur feeling more oppressive than comforting. She thought of Henry, of his quiet moments of trust, and the walls he had begun to rebuild after Beatrice's interference. I won't let her win, Clara whispered to herself, her resolve hardening. Inside, Beatrice watched her from the drawing room window, her glass of wine glinting in the moonlight. She smirked to herself. You made a mistake staying, Clara, and I always win. The sun filtered through the heavy curtains of Alexander Moore's hospital room, painting the sterile walls in soft hues of gold. The machines monitoring his vital signs beeped steadily, their rhythms unchanging for weeks. Doctors had warned that recovery could take months, or might never happen at all. Yet, there was an undercurrent of hope that lingered, fragile but present, in the hearts of those who visited him. That morning, Clara had taken Henry to see his father for the first time since the accident. Henry had been reluctant, afraid of what he might see. The idea of his father, his unshakable protector, lying lifeless and dependent on machines, filled the boy with an unease he couldn't put into words. Do I have to go? Henry asked as they stood outside the hospital room, his small hand clutching Clara's tightly. Clara knelt to his level, her hazel eyes meeting his green ones with quiet reassurance. You don't have to do anything you're not ready for, Henry. But sometimes, just being there can make a difference. Even if your dad can't talk back, he might be able to feel that you're there for him. Henry hesitated, then nodded. Okay. Inside the room, Henry's steps faltered when he saw Alexander. The sight was jarring. The man who had once seemed invincible now lay still, his face pale and framed by tubes and wires. Hi, Dad, Henry whispered, his voice barely audible as he approached the bed. He looked at Clara, who gave him an encouraging nod. I miss you. He reached out hesitantly, his small fingers brushing against his father's hand. The touch was brief, but the weight of it lingered in the room. Clara stood a few feet away, giving him space, but ready to comfort him if needed. For the next half hour, Henry stayed by his father's side, talking in halting sentences about his days at home, the books he was reading, and the flowers Clara had helped him plant in the garden. When it was time to leave, he squeezed Alexander's hand one last time. "Please come back, Dad," he said softly. That evening, something extraordinary happened. A nurse on the night shift was the first to notice. As she performed her routine check on Alexander's vitals, she saw the faintest flicker of movement beneath his eyelids. Her heart leaped. "Dr. Phelps," she called, rushing to alert the attending physician. Within minutes, a team had gathered around Alexander's bedside. His breathing remained steady, and his fingers twitched slightly as if grasping for something unseen. Then, slowly, his eyes fluttered open, revealing a dazed but unmistakably conscious gaze. "Mr. Moore," Dr. Phelps said, his voice calm but urgent. "Can you hear me?" Alexander's eyes shifted, taking in the faces around him. His lips parted, and though his voice was hoarse and weak, he managed to rasp a single word: "Henry." The news of Alexander's awakening spread quickly, reaching the Moore estate the next morning. Clara was in the kitchen helping Henry with breakfast when Mrs. Edith hurried in, her face alight with emotion. "He's awake," she announced breathlessly. Clara froze, the spatula in her hand slipping to the counter. "What? Your father, Henry," Mrs. Edith said, turning to the boy. "He woke up last night." Henry's eyes widened in disbelief. "Dad's awake." "Yes, darling," Mrs. Edith said, pulling him into a hug. "The doctor said he's still weak, but he's conscious and asking for you." Henry's face lit up with a mixture of joy and relief. He turned to Clara, his smile tentative but genuine. "We have to go see him." Clara nodded, her heart swelling. "Of course, Henry. Let's go." When they arrived at the hospital, Alexander was propped up in bed, looking pale but alert. His eyes softened the moment he saw Henry enter the room. "Hey, buddy," Alexander said, his voice still raspy but filled with warmth. "Dad." Henry ran to his father's side, throwing his arms around him. Tears spilled freely down his cheeks as he clung to Alexander. "I missed you so much." "I missed you too," Alexander said, his hands stroking Henry's hair. His gaze shifted to Clara, who stood quietly near the door, unsure if she should intrude on the reunion. "Who's this?" Alexander asked, his voice curious but kind. Henry pulled back, wiping his eyes. "This is Clara. She's been helping me while you were gone. She's really nice, Dad. She's the best." Alexander's eyes lingered on Clara, a flicker of gratitude in his expression. "Thank you," he said simply, the weight of those two words filling the room. Clara smiled, her voice soft. "I'm just glad I could help." But outside the room, another figure lurked, watching with sharp, calculating eyes. Beatrice, having heard the news, had rushed to the hospital with a plan already forming in her mind. The moment she saw Alexander, she swept into the room with dramatic flair. "Alexander," she cried, her tone dripping with false emotion. "Thank God you're awake. We've all been so worried." Alexander's brow furrowed slightly at the sight of her. "Beatrice, what are you doing here?" "I've been helping at the house, of course," she said smoothly, ignoring the flicker of irritation in his eyes. "Taking care of Henry, making sure everything was running smoothly. It's been such a difficult time, but I knew you'd want me to step in." Alexander glanced at Henry, who shifted uncomfortably. Then his gaze returned to Clara, who stood quietly, observing the exchange. Something about her calm demeanor, the way she didn't clamor for his attention or try to insert herself into the narrative, struck him as genuine. "Well," Alexander said, his voice firm despite his weakness, "it sounds like there's a lot I need to catch up on." Beatrice's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Of course, and I'll be here to help with anything you need." Her eyes flicked briefly to Clara, a silent challenge gleaming in their depths. Clara met her gaze, her own resolve unshaken. She had come too far to back down now. Alexander's return to consciousness sent ripples through the Moore household. While Henry's spirits lifted with his father's recovery, the tensions simmering beneath the surface began to rise to the forefront. Beatrice, sensing her grip on the situation slipping, became even more determined to assert control. But Alexander, though weakened by weeks of inactivity, wasn't a man easily swayed. As he spent his first few days regaining his strength in the hospital, he quietly observed the dynamics around him. Clara's quiet competence and natural rapport with Henry contrasted sharply with Beatrice's forced enthusiasm and performative concern. Still, doubts lingered. Alexander hadn't forgotten the fragility of trust in a world where his wealth and influence made him a target. He needed to understand who Clara really was, and whether her presence in his son's life was truly as selfless as it seemed. One evening, Beatrice took the opportunity to plant a seed of doubt. Alexander was sitting up in his hospital bed, flipping through Henry's latest drawings, a collection of whimsical creatures and imagined worlds, when Beatrice entered. She carried a bouquet of white roses, her expression carefully arranged into one of gentle concern. "I thought these might brighten your room," she said, placing the vase on the bedside table. "Thank you," Alexander replied, his tone polite but distant. Beatrice perched delicately on the edge of a chair beside him. "You've been so brave, Alex. Truly. And Henry, well, he's been through so much. It's heartbreaking to see him so vulnerable." Alexander nodded. "He's a strong boy. I've missed him more than I can say." Beatrice sighed dramatically. "It's just hard to know who to trust in times like these. You'd think people would show their true colors, but sometimes they're so good at hiding their motives." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "What are you trying to say?" She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Clara, don't you think it's strange how quickly she stepped into this role? I mean, she's just a nurse. How could she possibly understand what Henry needs?" Alexander frowned. "Henry seems to trust her. That means something to me." "Of course," Beatrice said quickly, "but trust can be so easily manipulated, especially in someone as young as Henry. Don't you wonder why she's really here? What her background is? I mean, we don't know anything about her." Alexander's expression darkened slightly, but he didn't respond. Beatrice sensed she had struck a chord and pressed on. "I'm not saying she's a bad person," she said, her tone feigning innocence. "I'm just saying it's worth looking into, for Henry's sake." The next day, Alexander quietly tasked Charles Whitmore with investigating Clara's past. Whitmore hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the request. "Are you sure about this, Alex?" he asked as they spoke in the hospital room. Alexander nodded, his tone firm. "It's not about suspicion. It's about clarity. If she's going to be in Henry's life, I need to know who she is." Within a day, Whitmore returned with a file containing the information Alexander had requested. As Alexander skimmed the pages, a clearer picture of Clara's life began to emerge. She had grown up in a small, working-class town in Pennsylvania, the youngest of 3 children. Her father had passed away when she was 10, leaving her mother to raise the family on a modest income. Clara had excelled academically, earning a scholarship to nursing school, where she graduated near the top of her class. But her life had not been without hardship. A few years earlier, her mother had been diagnosed with cancer. Clara had taken on extra shifts to pay for her treatment, juggling work and caregiving with little time for herself. Her mother's passing had left her deeply in debt, forcing her to put aside her dreams of furthering her education to focus on survival. The file painted a portrait of a woman who was determined, selfless, and resilient, but also vulnerable in ways Alexander hadn't anticipated. That evening, Alexander asked to speak with Clara privately. She arrived at his hospital room feeling a mixture of nervousness and determination. "You wanted to see me?" she asked, stepping inside. "Yes," Alexander said, gesturing for her to take a seat. He studied her for a moment, his piercing blue eyes searching hers. "I want to thank you for everything you've done for Henry while I've been unavailable." "It's been my privilege," Clara said earnestly. "Henry is an incredible boy. I'm just glad I could be there for him. Alexander nodded slowly. That's why I wanted to talk to you. Clara, I had Whitmore look into your background. Clara stiffened, her heart sinking. You investigated me. Alexander held up a hand. Please understand, this isn't about mistrust. It's about knowing who my son is spending his time with. And I have to say, your story speaks volumes about your character. Clara blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected praise. Oh, I don't know what to say. You've been through more than most people could handle, Alexander continued. And yet, you've chosen to dedicate yourself to helping others. That's not something I take lightly. Clara swallowed, her voice trembling slightly. I didn't want to bring my past here. It's not something I talk about easily. I understand, Alexander said, but it's part of who you are, and from what I've seen, it's made you the kind of person Henry needs right now. For the first time since her arrival, Clara felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She nodded, her eyes misting with emotion. Thank you, Mr. Moore. That means a lot. As she rose to leave, Alexander called after her. And Clara, don't let Beatrice get to you. She thrives on creating doubt. But from where I stand, you've earned Henry's trust and mine. Clara smiled faintly, her resolve strengthening. I won't, Mr. Moore. I promise. Outside the hospital, Beatrice waited in her car, scrolling through her phone with a growing sense of urgency. She had expected her plan to sow distrust, but it seemed Alexander was more perceptive than she had anticipated. This isn't over, she muttered to herself, her nails digging into the leather steering wheel. Alexander returned to the Moore estate with much fanfare. Staff lined the grand foyer as his wheelchair was rolled inside, his expression stoic but tinged with gratitude. Henry clung to his side, his small hand never letting go of his father's, as though afraid that if he loosened his grip, Alexander might disappear again. Clara stood at the edge of the gathering, her emotions a mix of relief and trepidation. Welcome home, sir, Mrs. Edith said, her voice thick with emotion as she dabbed at her eyes. Thank you, Alexander replied, his voice steady but tired. His gaze swept over the faces before landing on Clara. For a moment, the din of the household seemed to fade, leaving only the unspoken understanding that passed between them. Clara, he said, inclining his head slightly. Mr. Moore, she replied, her tone formal but warm. Beatrice was less subtle in her return. She swooped into the scene like an actress taking center stage, bending down to clasp Alexander's hand. Alex, it's so good to have you back. The house just hasn't been the same without you. Alexander's polite smile didn't reach his eyes. Thank you, Beatrice. I appreciate your concern. She lingered by his side, positioning herself as though she were the natural second in command of household. But Alexander's focus had already shifted back to Henry, who tugged at his arm. Come on, Dad. I want to show you what Clara and I planted in the garden. Beatrice's lips tightened, but Alexander nodded at his son. Lead the way. The garden was a riot of color, with rows of flowers and leafy plants standing as a testament to Clara and Henry's quiet hours of labor. Clara followed them outside, keeping a respectful distance as Henry chattered excitedly about the different types of plants they had chosen and the care they required. You planted all of this? Alexander asked, his voice filled with genuine curiosity. Yeah, Henry said, beaming. Clara taught me how to do it. She said it's like taking care of something that depends on you. Like you take care of me. Alexander's throat tightened at the boy's innocent words. He glanced over at Clara, who had knelt by a row of daisies, her fingers brushing over their petals with an almost maternal care. Thank you, Clara, Alexander said, his voice quieter now. Clara looked up, surprised. It was nothing. Henry did most of the work. It's not nothing, Alexander replied, his tone firm but kind. You've given him something to hold on to, something to focus on when things felt uncertain. That's everything. Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest, but quickly deflected. He's a remarkable kid. I just helped a little. Henry, sensing the conversation becoming too serious, grabbed Alexander's hand. Come on, Dad, let's go see the tree I planted. As the days passed, Alexander settled into a routine, though his recovery was slow. Physical therapy sessions left him drained, and the effort of simply navigating his home in a wheelchair required adjustments that tested his patience. Through it all, Clara remained a steady presence. At first, she kept her interactions with Alexander professional and reserved, unsure of the boundaries in their evolving dynamic. She would bring him tea in the library as he sifted through paperwork or offer quiet encouragement when he struggled with a particularly grueling therapy session. But gradually, their conversations began to deepen, shifting from polite exchanges to moments of shared understanding. One evening, as Clara returned a book to the library, she found Alexander sitting by the fire, a glass of whiskey in hand. He looked up when she entered, the flickering light casting shadows across his face. "Clara," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "Care to join me?" Clara hesitated, then sat down. "Shouldn't you be resting?" Alexander chuckled softly. "That's all anyone ever tells me to do these days." I needed a moment to think. She nodded, unsure of what to say. "I've been meaning to ask," Alexander said after a pause. "How did you end up here?" "At the hospital, I mean." Clara leaned back, her gaze drifting to the fire. "I always wanted to help people," she said. "Growing up, my family didn't have much, but my mom, she taught me that kindness didn't cost anything. When she got sick, I had to juggle school and taking care of her, and that's when I realized how important it is to have someone in your corner during hard times. I guess I wanted to be that person for others." Alexander studied her, his expression thoughtful. "And yet, you chose to step into a life so different from your own. A mansion, a wealthy family, a 10-year-old boy who lost his mother and almost lost his father. That's not exactly an easy corner to step into." Clara smiled faintly. Henry needed someone. That's all that mattered. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the crackling fire filling the silence. "You remind me of Emma," Alexander said quietly, his voice tinged with emotion. Clara looked up, startled. "Your wife?" He nodded, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. She had that same quiet strength. She made people feel safe, even when everything around them was falling apart. "I see that in you." Clara didn't know how to respond. The weight of his words settled over her, filling her with both a sense of pride and an ache she couldn't quite place. As the weeks went on, Alexander found himself seeking out Clara's company more often. Their conversations, once guarded, became a source of solace for him. They discussed everything from Henry's progress in school to Alexander's frustrations with his limited mobility. Clara listened without judgment, offering perspective when he needed it and silence when he didn't. One afternoon, as they sat on the terrace overlooking the garden, Alexander turned to her suddenly. "Clara, have you ever thought about what's next for you? Beyond this house, beyond Henry's?" Clara blinked, caught off guard. "I haven't really. I've been so focused on the present that I haven't given much thought to the future." "You should," Alexander said, his tone soft but insistent. "You have a gift for connecting with people. You could do so much, Clara." Her cheeks flushed, and she looked away. "I'm just doing what anyone would do in my position." "Don't underestimate yourself," Alexander replied. "Not everyone will have done what you've done. I see that, even if others don't." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the air between them felt charged with something unspoken. Clara quickly broke the gaze, turning her attention back to the garden. But not everyone in the house was blind to the growing connection between Clara and Alexander. Beatrice watched with increasing fury as Alexander began to include Clara in more and more of his daily life. She could see the way his eyes lingered on her when she spoke, the way his voice softened when addressing her. "It's ridiculous," Beatrice muttered to herself as she paced the length of her suite. "She's a nurse. Nothing more. He'll see that soon enough." Determined to regain control, Beatrice decided it was time to escalate her plans. Clara might have won Henry's trust and Alexander's respect, but Beatrice wasn't about to let her win his heart. That night, Clara stood alone on the balcony outside her room, staring up at the stars. The weight of the day pressed heavily on her shoulders, but in the stillness, She allowed herself a moment to breathe. She didn't hear the door open behind her. She didn't hear the door open behind her. "Clara," Alexander's voice called softly, pulling her from her thoughts. She turned, startled to find him standing there, leaning on his cane. "Mr. Moore, you shouldn't be walking without help." "I'm fine," he interrupted gently. I wanted to thank you for everything." Clara smiled, though her heart ached with the knowledge that her time in the Moore household would inevitably come to an end. "You don't need to thank me. I was just doing my job." Alexander stepped closer, his blue eyes searching hers. "You've done more than that, Clara. You've given my son hope when he needed it most. And you've reminded me what it feels like to trust someone again." Clara's breath hitched, but before she could respond, Alexander straightened, his expression softening. "Good night, Clara." As he turned and walked away, Clara leaned against the balcony railing, her heart pounding in a way she hadn't expected. The tension within the Moore household had grown palpable. Clara could feel it in the way Beatrice's presence seemed to linger in every room, her sharp eyes watching, her lips curling into a calculated smile whenever she caught Clara in conversation with Alexander. It wasn't long before Beatrice's passive-aggressive comments turned into outright interference. Late one morning, Clara stepped into the kitchen to find Mary, the cook, packing up the lunches Clara had asked her to prepare for Henry's outing to the park. But the sandwiches and snacks that Clara had carefully planned were nowhere to be seen. "What's all this?" Clara asked, gesturing to the elaborate spread of miniature quiches and imported cheeses. "Miss Hastings made some changes," Mary said, her tone cautious as she avoided Clara's gaze. "She said Henry deserved something finer." Clara bit back her irritation. "Henry doesn't need finer. He needs something he'll actually eat. Did Miss Hastings consult me about this?" Mary shook her head. "She said she knows what's best." Clara sighed, her jaw tightening. "I see." She was about to carry the tray to the dining room when Beatrice sauntered in, her heels clicking on the tiled floor. "Clara," Beatrice said brightly, though her tone dripped with false sweetness. "I hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of revising the menu. Henry deserves something elevated, don't you think? After all, he is a Moore." "Henry doesn't care about fancy food," Clara said, keeping her voice steady. "He just wants something familiar, something that reminds him of normalcy." Beatrice's smile didn't falter. "Normalcy? Is that what you're offering him? A nurse's idea of a happy meal?" Clara set the tray down carefully, her gaze locking with Beatrice's. "I don't have time for games, Miss Hastings. Henry's well-being is my priority, and I won't let your meddling disrupt that." Beatrice's eyes narrowed, the veneer of politeness cracking. "Let's not pretend you're anything more than a temporary fixture here, Clara. When Alexander regains his full strength, he'll see that. You'll be gone, and I'll still be here." That afternoon, Beatrice decided it was time to accelerate her plans. She needed Alexander to see Clara not as the kind, capable woman who had supported his son, but as a threat to their family's harmony and their fortune. Beatrice began spreading rumors among the staff, whispering just loud enough to be overheard. "It's strange, isn't it?" she said to Mary and one of the maids in the laundry room. How quickly she ingratiated herself with Alexander and Henry. "Makes you wonder what her endgame is." "I don't know," Mary replied hesitantly. "She seems to genuinely care about Henry." Beatrice laughed, a sharp, hollow sound. "Oh, darling, you're too trusting. People like Clara always have an agenda. Just wait, you'll see." The whispers took root. Soon, Clara noticed subtle shifts in how the staff interacted with her. Conversations quieted when she entered a room. Tasks she had delegated were suddenly undone or ignored. Even Mrs. Edith, who had always been warm and supportive, seemed more hesitant, her kind smiles replaced with faint unease. The breaking point came one evening when Beatrice staged her most daring move yet. She waited until Clara had gone to check on Henry before slipping into Alexander's study. The room was quiet, the faint smell of leather and aged paper filling the air as Alexander worked through a stack of documents. "Alex," Beatrice said softly, stepping inside. Alexander looked up, his expression neutral. "Beatrice, what is it?" "I need to talk to you." she said, her tone heavy with concern as she approached his desk. "It's about Clara." Alexander sighed, setting down his pen. "What about her?" Beatrice leaned against the desk, folding her arms. "I'm worried about her influence over Henry and over you." Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly. "What are you trying to say?" "She's been here for months, Alex," Beatrice continued, her voice growing more urgent. "And in that time, she's managed to position herself as indispensable. But do you really know her? Do you know where she comes from? What she wants?" "I know enough," Alexander said firmly. "Do you?" Beatrice countered. "Because I've done some digging, and what I found isn't exactly reassuring." Alexander's jaw tightened. "What are you talking about?" Beatrice hesitated, as though weighing her next words carefully. Then, with an air of feigned reluctance, she said, "Her past, her debts, the financial struggles she's faced. Don't you think it's convenient that she's suddenly found herself in the good graces of one of Boston's wealthiest families?" Alexander's expression hardened. "I'm aware of her circumstances, Beatrice. I asked Whitmore to look into her background weeks ago. There's nothing suspicious about it." Beatrice blinked, clearly caught off guard. You knew." "Yes," Alexander said sharply. "And what I found only confirmed what I already believed. Clara is a dedicated, selfless woman who has done more for this family than most would. She's here because she cares about Henry, not because she has some ulterior motive." Beatrice's face twisted into a mask of frustration. "Alex, you're being naive. She's playing on your sympathy." "That's enough," Alexander interrupted, his voice cold. He rose from his chair, leaning heavily on his cane. "I've indulged your concerns long enough. Clara stays, and that's the end of it." Beatrice stared at him, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for a response. Finally, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the room, her heels clicking angrily against the polished floor. Clara found herself outside on the terrace later that evening, needing a moment of quiet to collect her thoughts. The weight of the day's events pressed heavily on her chest, but as she stared out at the garden, a sense of resolve began to take root. She wouldn't let Beatrice's scheming drive her away. Henry needed her, and Alexander trusted her. That was enough. The sound of the door opening behind her made her turn. Alexander stepped outside, his cane tapping lightly against the stone floor. "Clara," he said, his tone gentle. "Mr. Moore," she replied, a hint of surprise in her voice. "Is everything all right?" "I should be asking you that," he said, stopping a few feet away. "Beatrice, she's crossed a line." Clara hesitated. "I didn't want to cause trouble." "You didn't," Alexander said firmly. "Beatrice thrives on creating chaos. But I won't let her drive you away. You've done too much for this family, for Henry, for me, to let her undermine that." Clara felt a lump rise in her throat. "Thank you," she said quietly. Alexander's gaze softened. "You're part of this household now, Clara, and no one, not even Beatrice, will change that." For the first time in weeks, Clara felt a flicker of hope. Inside the house, Beatrice stood at her bedroom window, watching as Alexander and Clara spoke on the terrace. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her mind racing with fury and desperation. "If they think I'm finished," she muttered to herself, her voice low and venomous, "they're dead wrong." Her next move would be bold, dangerous even. But Beatrice wasn't about to let her plans unravel without a fight. The days following Alexander's confrontation with Beatrice were fraught with tension. Though Beatrice had been temporarily silenced, her presence in the Moore household was like a storm cloud on the horizon, dark and brooding. She kept to herself for the most part, but the sharpness of her gaze whenever she crossed paths with Clara spoke volumes. Clara, for her part, had tried to focus on Henry. The boy seemed to have regained some of his light since his father's return, but shadows still lingered in his eyes, remnants of the uncertainty and fear he had endured. Clara worried that the constant strain in the house, the undercurrents of mistrust and manipulation, would undo the progress they had made together. One evening, after a particularly strained dinner where Beatrice had pointedly ignored Clara's presence, Clara found herself in the kitchen, scrubbing dishes with more force than necessary. Mary, the cook, stood nearby, awkwardly drying a plate as if she wanted to say something but didn't know how. Finally, Mary cleared her throat. "Miss Davidson, I've been meaning to apologize." Clara paused, surprised. "For what?" "For the way some of us have treated you," Mary admitted, her voice low. "There's been talk about you, about why you're here. Most of it came from Miss Hastings, and, well, I think some of us believed her." Clara set the dish down, turning to face Mary. "And now," Mary hesitated, then gave a small, sheepish smile. "Now, I see how much you care about Henry, about all of this. You've been nothing but kind, and I'm sorry for doubting you." Clara smiled softly, the apology easing a small part of the burden she carried. "Thank you, Mary. That means a lot." But the damage Beatrice had done wasn't so easily erased. The whispers had taken root, and even Alexander's assurances couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over Clara. One night, as Clara sat alone in her room, a knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Alexander standing there, his cane in one hand and an envelope in the other. "Mr. Moore," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "Is everything all right?" Alexander handed her the envelope without a word. Confused, Clara opened it to find a copy of a legal document, a proposal drafted by Beatrice and sent to Alexander's attorney earlier that day. "She's trying to push me out," Clara said quietly, her hands trembling slightly as she read through the document. "She wants me to dismiss you," Alexander confirmed, his voice low. "She's claiming you're a liability to the household, that your influence on Henry is inappropriate." Clara's stomach churned. "And what do you think?" "I think it's nonsense," Alexander said firmly. "Beatrice is grasping at straws. But this," he gestured to the document, "this shows how far she's willing to go." Clara set the paper down, a heavy silence settling between them. Finally, she spoke. "Maybe she's right." Alexander's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" "Maybe I don't belong here," Clara said, her voice tinged with sadness. "Since the moment I arrived, I've been fighting to prove myself. To Henry, to the staff, to you. And no matter what I do, it feels like it's never enough." "Clara," Alexander began, but she shook her head. "You've already had to defend me against her accusations. How many more battles are you going to have to fight because of me? How much more strain can this family take?" Alexander took a step closer, his voice softening. "You've been nothing but a positive force in Henry's life and mine. Don't let Beatrice convince you otherwise." Clara looked away, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. "I just want what's best for Henry. Maybe that means stepping back before things get worse." Alexander's hand tightened on his cane, frustration flashing across his face. "Leaving won't solve anything. It will only give Beatrice what she wants." Clara met his gaze, her voice trembling. "And staying will only make me a target. I don't want to be the reason this family falls apart." The next morning, Clara made her decision. She packed her things quietly, not wanting to alarm Henry or draw attention to herself. She left a note for him on his bedside table, explaining that she was leaving but would always be there for him if he ever needed her. The thought of his reaction, a mix of confusion, hurt, and betrayal, nearly broke her resolve, but she forced herself to push through. As she carried her suitcase downstairs, she encountered Mrs. Edith in the foyer. The elderly governess looked at her with wide, questioning eyes. "Miss Davidson," Mrs. Edith said, her voice trembling. "What are you doing?" Clara smiled weakly. "It's time for me to go." Mrs. Edith's hands fluttered to her chest. "But why? Henry needs you." "We all do." Clara shook her head. "Not like this. My being here has caused too much tension. It's better for everyone if I step away." Before Mrs. Edith could respond, Henry's voice echoed from the top of the stairs. "Clara." Clara turned to see him standing there, his small frame silhouetted against the morning light. He looked at her suitcase, realization dawning on his face. "You're leaving?" he asked, his voice breaking. Clara felt tears welling up as she set the suitcase down and knelt to his level. Henry, her voice faltered. I think this is what's best for you and your dad. Henry shook his head furiously, tears streaming down his cheeks. No, you said you wouldn't leave. You promised. Clara's heart shattered at his words. I know, and I'm so sorry. But this isn't goodbye, Henry. You can call me anytime, and I'll always be here for you. I don't want you to go, he cried, throwing his arms around her neck. Clara hugged him tightly, her own tears falling freely. I'm so proud of you, Henry. You're stronger than you know, and you're going to be okay. I promise. As Clara stepped outside, suitcase in hand, she found Alexander waiting by the car. He leaned heavily on his cane, his expression unreadable. This is a mistake, he said quietly. Maybe, Clara replied, her voice heavy with regret. But it's my decision. Alexander looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. I won't try to stop you, but I want you to know that this house won't be the same without you. Clara managed a small smile. Thank you, Mr. Moore, for everything. As the car pulled away from the mansion, Clara looked back at the sprawling estate that had come to feel like both a home and a battleground. She didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain. She would carry Henry and Alexander with her no matter where life took her next. Inside the mansion, Henry wept in his father's arms, and Alexander's gaze hardened with determination. This wasn't over. The silence in the Moore mansion after Clara's departure was deafening. For Henry, it was unbearable. The boy spent the next 2 days locked in his room, refusing to eat or speak to anyone, even Alexander. The absence of Clara, the one person who had managed to soothe his fears and make him feel whole again, was a wound too raw to ignore. Alexander, watching his son retreat into himself, felt a surge of guilt. He had failed to protect Clara from the poisonous influence of Beatrice, and in doing so, he had let Henry down as well. The final straw came on the third morning after Clara's departure. Alexander was in the dining room, staring at a cup of tea he hadn't touched, when Henry stormed in, his face red and tear-streaked. Why did you let her leave? The boy shouted, his small fists clenched at his sides. Alexander looked up, startled. Henry, she didn't want to go. I know she didn't. You made her leave, didn't you? No, son, Alexander said, his voice steady but heavy with regret. I didn't make her leave. She thought it was the best thing for us. Well, it wasn't. Henry yelled, his voice cracking. It was the worst thing ever. The boy ran out of the room before Alexander could respond, leaving him sitting in the suffocating quiet. For a long time, he didn't move, the weight of Henry's words pressing down on him like a physical force. When he finally rose from his chair, it wasn't with hesitation or uncertainty. It was with a grim resolve that burned in his chest. Beatrice had orchestrated this chaos, and Alexander intended to put an end to it. Beatrice was in the drawing room, sipping champagne and flipping through a glossy magazine when Alexander entered. She looked up with a practiced smile, one that faltered slightly when she saw the fire in his eyes. Alex, she said, setting the glass down with deliberate care. You look like you've had a rough morning. Can I get you anything? No, Alexander said curtly, his cane tapping sharply against the wooden floor as he approached. But you can listen. Beatrice blinked, her smile freezing. Of course. What's on your mind? Alexander didn't sit, his towering presence looming over her. Clara's gone. Henry hasn't eaten in 2 days, and he's barely spoken a word. And do you know why that is, Beatrice? Beatrice's eyes darted to the side, her composure slipping. Alex, it's because of you, Alexander continued, his voice like steel. You've been poisoning this household since the moment I woke up, spreading lies and manipulating people to serve your own agenda. And now, thanks to your scheming, Henry has lost someone who meant the world to him. Beatrice's expression hardened, her carefully crafted mask of innocence cracking. Alex, I was only trying to protect this family. Clara was. Stop, Alexander interrupted, his tone sharp enough to make her flinch. You weren't protecting anyone but yourself. You saw Clara as a threat, not because she was doing anything wrong, but because she was doing everything right. She succeeded where you failed, earning Henry's trust, supporting this family without expecting anything in return. And you couldn't stand it. Beatrice rose from the couch, her lips thinning into a hard line. You're being unfair. I've been loyal to you, to this family, for years. I've always had your best interests at heart. Loyalty. Alexander spat the word like it was poison. Loyalty is about more than proximity, Beatrice. It's about actions, not words. Clara gave without asking. She cared for Henry with a kindness you'll never understand. And instead of supporting her, you tore her down. Beatrice's face flushed with anger. She was using you, Alex. Using this family. She came from nothing. She wanted to secure her future by worming her way into yours. How could you be so blind? Alexander's grip on his cane tightened, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet tone. I had her background checked, Beatrice. I know exactly who Clara is, and I know exactly who you are. Do you want to talk about blind loyalty? Let's talk about your repeated attempts to undermine this family for your own benefit. Beatrice's eyes widened. What are you insinuating? I'm not insinuating anything, Alexander said coldly. I'm stating facts. You've been circling this family like a vulture, waiting for your chance to pick it apart. But let me make something perfectly clear. Your time here is over. Beatrice's mouth fell open in shock. You're dismissing me? Yes, Alexander said without hesitation. Pack your things and leave. Today. Beatrice's hands curled into fists at her sides, her voice rising in desperation. You can't do this. After everything I've done for you, for Henry, you've done nothing for Henry, Alexander snapped. You've only made his life harder. And as for me, I'll admit I tolerated your presence for far too long. But that ends now. Beatrice's fury bubbled over, her composure shattering completely. You'll regret this, Alex. You'll see. She'll betray you. She'll take everything from you, just like I warned. Alexander stared her down, his expression unyielding. The only regret I have is not seeing through you sooner. Now, get out. Beatrice stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind her. For a moment, Alexander allowed himself to lean heavily on his cane, his exhaustion catching up with him. But the sight of Henry peeking around the corner of the hallway gave him a renewed sense of purpose. Henry, Alexander said gently, beckoning him closer. The boy hesitated, then shuffled into the room, his eyes red-rimmed from crying. Is she gone? She will be, Alexander promised. He knelt down, ignoring the strain on his legs, and placed a hand on Henry's shoulder. I'm sorry I didn't act sooner, son, but I'm going to fix this. I'm going to make things right. How? Henry asked, his voice small. I'm going to bring Clara back, Alexander said firmly. Henry's eyes lit up with a flicker of hope. You mean it? I mean it, Alexander replied. She never should have left, and I won't rest until she's home where she belongs. Later that evening, Alexander sat in his study, staring out the window as the sun dipped below the horizon. His mind was already racing with plans to track Clara down, to apologize for letting her face Beatrice's venom alone. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Clara was fiercely independent, and convincing her to return would take more than just words. He would have to show her that she was truly valued, not just by Henry, but by him as well. As he watched the first stars appear in the night sky, Alexander made a silent vow. He wouldn't let fear or pride stand in the way. Clara had given so much to his family, and it was time he did the same for her. Upstairs, Beatrice packed her belongings with trembling hands, her mind racing with fury and humiliation. She had underestimated Clara, and now she was paying the price. But as she stuffed the last of her clothes into a designer suitcase, her lips curled into a bitter smile. This isn't over, she muttered to herself. Not by a long shot. The morning was quiet at the Moore estate, but it was a deceptive kind of calm. The aftermath of Beatrice's departure still hung in the air, a tension that neither Henry nor Alexander could entirely shake. Henry, though buoyed by the promise his father had made to bring Clara back, lingered in a state of uncertainty. Alexander, on the other hand, was resolute. He had spent the better part of the previous night making calls, reaching out to Clara's former colleagues and contacts. By morning, he had pieced together enough information to locate her, a small apartment on the outskirts of Boston. Alexander sat at the breakfast table, nursing a cup of coffee as Henry shuffled in, still in his pajamas. The boy's face lit up slightly when he saw his father. "Are you really going to find her today?" Henry asked, his voice tinged with cautious hope. Alexander nodded, his gaze steady. "I am. And if I have anything to say about it, she'll be back here by tonight." Henry's lips curved into a small smile, but it was tentative. What if she doesn't want to come back? Alexander leaned forward, his hand resting on Henry's shoulder. "I'll do everything I can to make her understand how much she means to us. To you, especially. But no matter what, I'll make sure she knows she's not alone." The drive to Clara's apartment was a sobering one. Alexander had insisted on going alone, despite Mrs. Edith's concern about his stamina. He was still recovering, and navigating Boston's narrow streets in his condition was no easy task. But he refused to let anything deter him. The neighborhood where Clara lived was modest, a stark contrast to the opulence of the Moore estate. As Alexander pulled up to the building, he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. Clara had left behind the comforts of his home to return to a life of quiet struggle, all because he hadn't acted quickly enough to protect her. He made his way to the second floor, his cane clicking against the worn wooden stairs. When he reached her door, he hesitated for a moment before knocking. There was a pause, followed by the sound of light footsteps. When the door opened, Clara stood there, her eyes widening in surprise at the sight of him. "Mr. Moore," she said, her voice laced with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" Alexander smiled faintly, though his heart was pounding. "Clara, I need to talk to you." She stepped aside to let him in, her small apartment tidy but sparse. The walls were decorated with a few framed photographs and simple artwork, and the scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air. Alexander took a seat on the worn sofa, his cane resting beside him. "I wasn't expecting to see you," Clara said, sitting across from him in a faded armchair. "Is everything all right? Is Henry okay?" "Henry's adjusting," Alexander said carefully. "He misses you. We both do." Clara looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting together. "I miss him too, but I thought leaving was the right thing to do." The house felt so tense, like I was making everything worse just by being there. "You weren't," Alexander said firmly. "The tension wasn't because of you. It was because of Beatrice. She's gone now." Clara's eyes flicked up to meet his. "Gone. I told her to leave," Alexander explained. "She crossed too many lines, and I won't allow anyone in my home who doesn't have Henry's best interests at heart. Or mine." Clara leaned back, letting the words sink in. "I don't know what to say." "Then let me say what I came here to say," Alexander said, his tone softening. "Clara, I failed you. I let Beatrice's schemes fester for too long, and it cost us. It cost Henry the one person who's been there for him through all of this, and it cost me the chance to make things right before you left." Clara's expression wavered, emotions flickering across her face. "You didn't fail me, Mr. Moore. I made the choice to leave because I thought it was what your family needed. What my family needs," Alexander said, leaning forward, "is you. Henry needs you. I need you. Clara, you've done more for us in a few months than some people have in a lifetime, and I won't stand by and let you walk away thinking you weren't good enough, or that you didn't belong." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. "I don't know if I can come back. Not after everything that happened. The whispers, the doubts. It was exhausting." Alexander nodded, his gaze steady. "I understand. But if you come back, it'll be different. Beatrice is gone, and I won't let anyone else treat you the way she did. You'll have my full support, Clara. Always." Clara looked at him, her heart torn. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that things could be different. But the scars left by Beatrice's cruelty ran deep. "And if I come back," she asked quietly, "what happens then?" "Then you come back to a home where you're valued, not just as a caretaker, but as part of our family," Alexander said. You'll have a chance to continue the work you've started with Henry and to build something better for yourself, too. Clara's lips trembled, and for a long moment, she didn't speak. Finally, she whispered, "I don't know if I deserve that." Alexander's voice softened. "You do, Clara. You deserve more than you've allowed yourself to believe. Let us give that to you." The conversation stretched into the afternoon, the tension between them slowly unraveling as they spoke about everything. The fears that had driven Clara to leave, the guilt Alexander carried for not acting sooner, and the hope that still lingered despite all. By the time Alexander rose to leave, Clara felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in weeks. Possibility. "I'll think about it," she said, standing in the doorway as he prepared to leave. "That's all I ask," Alexander replied. He hesitated, then added, "Henry would love to see you, Clara. Whenever you're ready." Clara nodded, her throat tight. "I'll be in touch." When Alexander returned to the estate, Henry was waiting anxiously in the foyer. "Well?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with anticipation. "She said she'd think about it," Alexander replied, ruffling Henry's hair. Henry frowned. "That's not a yes." "It's not a no either," Alexander said with a faint smile. "We'll give her time. She'll come back when she's ready." Henry seemed to accept this, though his impatience was evident. Alexander watched his son run off to the library, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to hope. Clara spent the next few days weighing her decision, her mind a whirlwind of doubts and possibilities. She thought of Henry's smile, the way his laughter had filled the mansion. She thought of Alexander's quiet strength and the vulnerability he had shared with her. In the end, it wasn't a matter of whether she could go back. It was a matter of whether she could imagine herself anywhere else. The morning Clara arrived back at the Moore estate was a brisk one, the late autumn air carrying a bite that hinted at the coming winter. She stood at the bottom of the long driveway, her heart pounding as she stared up at the sprawling mansion. The grandeur of the estate, so overwhelming when she first arrived months ago, now felt oddly familiar, almost welcoming. In her hand, Clara clutched a small overnight bag. Though Alexander had offered to send a car for her, she had insisted on coming on her own. This was her decision, her step forward. When she reached the front door, it swung open before she had the chance to knock. Henry stood there, his green eyes wide with excitement. "Clara," he exclaimed, launching himself into her arms. Clara staggered slightly under the force of his hug, but laughed as she hugged him back tightly. "Hey, kiddo, I missed you. I missed you more," Henry said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. He pulled back just enough to look up at her. "Are you back for real this time?" Clara hesitated, glancing over Henry's shoulder to see Alexander standing in the foyer. His blue eyes were steady and warm, filled with something that looked like relief. "That depends," Clara said, looking down at Henry. "Do you think you're ready to put up with me again?" Henry grinned. "I'm ready." "Then I guess I'm back," Clara said softly. Henry whooped with joy, grabbing her hand and dragging her into the house. As Clara stepped inside, Mrs. Edith appeared from the sitting room, her face lighting up at the sight of her. "Miss Davidson," Mrs. Edith said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's so good to see you again." "It's good to see you too, Mrs. Edith," Clara replied, smiling. Mary poked her head out from the kitchen, offering Clara a sheepish wave. "Welcome back, Miss Clara." "Thanks, Mary," Clara said warmly. Alexander waited until Henry had dragged Clara into the dining room to show her the cookies he had been saving, then approached her with a quiet smile. "I'm glad you're here," he said simply. Clara looked at him, her heart pounding. "So am I." The first few days back at the mansion were a whirlwind of activity. Henry was practically glued to Clara's side, insisting on showing her everything she had missed since her departure. Together, they tended to the garden, played board games in the library, and worked on a school project that involved building a miniature diorama of a medieval village. Clara felt her heart swell as she watched Henry laugh and chatter, the shadows of his earlier sadness slowly fading. One evening, after Henry had gone to bed, Clara found herself alone in the kitchen with Alexander. She was brewing a pot of chamomile tea, and he had come in for a glass of water. "Busy day?" Alexander asked, leaning against the counter as she poured the tea. "You could say that," Clara replied with a small laugh. "I think Henry's trying to make up for lost time." Alexander nodded, his expression softening. "He's happier with you here." "So am I." Clara glanced at him, her cheeks warming. "It's good to be back." For a moment, the silence between them felt charged. Alexander cleared his throat, shifting slightly. "I know I've said this before, but thank you, Clara, for coming back. I know it wasn't an easy decision." "It wasn't," Clara admitted, "but it was a right one. For Henry, and for me." Alexander's gaze lingered on her, his blue eyes filled with an emotion Clara couldn't quite name. Before she could say anything else, he nodded and turned to leave. "Good night, Clara," he said softly. "Good night, Mr. Moore." As the days turned into weeks, Clara found herself settling back into the rhythm of life at the Moore estate. But this time, things felt different. The air of tension and mistrust that had once clouded the house was gone, replaced by a sense of calm and possibility. Even the staff, who had once treated her with skepticism, now went out of their way to make her feel welcome. Mary often left little treats for her in the kitchen, and Mrs. Edith invited her to join them for afternoon tea in the sitting room. But it was Alexander's growing presence in her life that surprised her the most. They began spending more time together, not just as co-guardians of Henry, but as two people learning to lean on one another. Alexander shared stories about his late wife, Emma, and the early days of raising Henry alone. Clara, in turn, opened up about her childhood, her struggles, and the dreams she had once held close to her heart. One evening, as they sat on the terrace watching the sun dip below the horizon, Alexander turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "Clara," he said, his voice quiet, "do you ever think about what you want for yourself, beyond all of this?" Clara frowned slightly, her gaze distant. "I don't know. For so long, I've been focused on surviving, on taking care of others. I guess I haven't really thought about what I want." Alexander studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You should. You deserve to have a life that's yours, Clara. One that makes you happy." Clara's cheeks flushed, and she smiled faintly. "Maybe I'll figure that out someday." "Maybe we both will," Alexander said, his tone carrying a hint of something deeper. The more time Clara spent with Alexander, the more she found herself drawn to him. His strength, his kindness, his unwavering dedication to Henry, they were qualities that had always inspired her. But now, she saw another side of him, a vulnerability, a quiet yearning for connection that mirrored her own. She told herself it was foolish to think about him that way. He was her employer, a man who had already lost so much. And yet, every shared glance, every quiet conversation seemed to pull her closer. Henry, oblivious to the undercurrent between Clara and his father, was simply happy to have his family whole again. One afternoon, as Clara helped him plant tulip bulbs in the garden, he looked up at her with a mischievous grin. "Do you like my dad?" he asked suddenly. Clara froze, her cheeks flushing. "What? My dad?" Henry said, shrugging. "You guys spend a lot of time together now. Do you like him?" "Of course, I like him," Clara said carefully. "He's a good man." Henry smirked. "You should marry him." Clara nearly dropped the spade she was holding. "Henry." "What?" he said innocently. "You'd be a great mom. And my dad really likes you, you know." Clara's heart raced, but she forced herself to laugh it off. "Let's focus on planting these flowers, okay?" Henry giggled, but he didn't press the matter. That evening, as Clara sat alone in her room, Henry's words echoed in her mind. She shook her head, trying to push the thought away. But deep down, a part of her wondered, was it really so impossible? It was a crisp December evening, and the Moore estate was alive with a sense of quiet warmth. The halls, adorned with garlands of pine and twinkling lights, glimmered in the soft glow of the chandelier. Henry had been running around all day, eagerly preparing for a small holiday gathering that Alexander had arranged for the household staff and close friends. Clara had helped him decorate cookies earlier, the smell of cinnamon and sugar still lingering faintly in the air. By the time the guests arrived, the house felt vibrant, almost festive, a far cry from the somber silence that had once filled its grand rooms. Clara, dressed in a simple burgundy dress, was busy serving drinks in the dining room when she felt a presence behind her. "Clara," Alexander said, his deep voice cutting through the hum of conversation. She turned to find him standing there, dressed sharply in a dark suit, his piercing blue eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Yes, Mr. Moore," she asked, smiling softly. "Can I steal you away for a moment?" Clara's brow furrowed in mild confusion, but she nodded. "Of course." He led her to the terrace, where the night air carried the crisp scent of winter. The stars were bright overhead, the sky clear and cold. Alexander leaned on his cane slightly as he turned to face her. "I wanted to talk to you in private," he began, his voice steady but tinged with something Clara couldn't quite place. "Is everything all right?" Clara asked, her heart pounding. "It is," Alexander said, a faint smile touching his lips. "In fact, it's more than all right. Clara, since the day you came into this house, you've been a source of light, not just for Henry, but for me as well." Clara's cheeks flushed. "Mr. Moore, I was just doing what I could to help." "Please," he interrupted gently, "call me Alexander. And this isn't about obligation, Clara. It's about gratitude, and something more." She stared at him, her breath catching as his words began to sink in. "I've watched you rebuild this household from the inside out," Alexander continued. "You've brought Henry back to life after he nearly lost himself in grief. And somewhere along the way, you reminded me of what it means to feel hope again." "Alexander," Clara began, but she didn't know what to say. He took a step closer, his voice softening. "I've spent a long time convincing myself that my life began and ended with Emma, that I couldn't ask for more or expect to find happiness again. But you've shown me that there's still so much left to live for." Clara's heart raced as he reached into his pocket and produced a small velvet box. "Clara Davidson," Alexander said, his voice unwavering. "Will you marry me?" The world seemed to stand still as Clara stared at the ring inside the box. It was elegant and understated, a single diamond set in a band of gold, beautiful without being ostentatious. Clara began, her voice trembling. "Alexander, I don't know what to say." "Say yes," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "Say you'll stay, not because of obligation, but because you want to. Because you've already become part of this family, Clara. And I can't imagine it without you." Tears welled in Clara's eyes as she struggled to find the words. "I never expected this," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Neither did I," Alexander said with a faint smile. "But life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it. And this, us, it feels right, Clara. Don't you think?" Clara's gaze shifted to the ring, then back to Alexander. She thought of Henry's laughter, the warmth she felt in the house, the quiet strength she had found in herself since stepping into their lives. "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady and sure. "Yes, I'll marry you." The relief and joy that crossed Alexander's face were almost overwhelming. He slipped the ring onto Clara's finger with hands that trembled slightly, then pulled her into a gentle embrace. "Thank you," he whispered. Clara laughed softly, her tears spilling over. "I should be thanking you." From the doorway, Henry peeked out, his grin wide as he watched them. He didn't wait long before bursting onto the terrace, his voice ringing out. "Did she say yes?" he asked, bouncing on his toes. Clara turned to him, laughing as she held out her hand to show the ring. She said yes. Henry let out a whoop of joy and ran to throw his arms around both of them. "I knew it. I told you you should marry her." Alexander chuckled, ruffling his son's hair. "You did, didn't you? Looks like you were right, as usual." Henry beamed, looking up at Clara. "Does this mean you're my mom now?" Clara's heart swelled as she knelt to his level, cupping his face in her hands. "It means I'll always be here for you, Henry. No matter what. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of celebration. The news spread quickly among the staff and guests, who greeted the announcement with cheers and congratulations. Mrs. Edith hugged Clara tightly, her voice trembling with emotion as she said, "You deserve this, my dear." And so do they. Even Mary, who had once been wary of Clara, wiped a tear from her eye as she offered her best wishes. "He's lucky to have you," she said simply. But it was Alexander's quiet presence beside her that grounded Clara through it all. He stayed close, his hand finding hers whenever the room grew too loud or the attention too overwhelming. As the evening wound down and the guests began to leave, Alexander and Clara found themselves alone in the drawing room. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. "You're sure about this?" Clara asked, her voice quiet as she looked at him. "About us." Alexander reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Clara smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder as they watched the fire burn. For the first time in years, the future felt bright, filled with love, laughter, and the promise of a new beginning. The days leading up to Clara and Alexander's wedding passed in a flurry of excitement and preparation. The Moore estate buzzed with activity, every corner alive with the anticipation of the new chapter about to begin. The staff, once skeptical of Clara's place in the household, now rallied around her with warmth and genuine affection. "Nothing but the best for our Miss Clara," Mary said one afternoon as she whisked cream for the cake. Her cheeks were rosy with exertion, but her smile was bright. Mrs. Edith nodded, overseeing the arrangements with her usual precision. "She's earned every bit of happiness coming her way." Even Henry threw himself into the preparations with gusto. He took his role as ring bearer and assistant wedding planner, as he proudly proclaimed, very seriously. He pored over color swatches, inspected floral arrangements, and even helped Mary taste test the desserts, a job he enjoyed a little too much. "Are you sure we need vanilla cupcakes?" he asked, his mouth full of frosting. "The chocolate ones are way better." Clara laughed as she caught him sneaking another cupcake from the tray. "I think we can manage both, don't you?" Henry grinned, smudges of frosting on his face. "Okay, but I'm eating at least 3 at the wedding." The ceremony itself was simple but beautiful, held in the gardens that Clara and Henry had worked so hard to nurture. The late autumn air carried a crispness that only heightened the warmth of the occasion. Guests gathered in a semicircle around an elegant arch draped in white roses and greenery. Clara stood at the top of the garden path, her heart pounding as she took in the scene before her. She wore a flowing ivory gown, its delicate lace details catching the sunlight. Her hair was swept back into soft waves, and in her hands, she held a bouquet of pale pink roses. "You look beautiful," Mrs. Edith whispered, her eyes glistening with tears. "Thank you," Clara replied, her voice trembling. At the end of the aisle, Alexander stood waiting, his gaze locked on hers. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that emphasized his strong, commanding presence, but his expression was unguarded, filled with a mix of love and awe. Henry stood beside him, practically bouncing with excitement. As Clara walked down the aisle, her steps steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her, she felt an overwhelming sense of belonging. This wasn't just a wedding. It was the beginning of a family, of a life filled with purpose and connection. The vows were heartfelt, each word resonating deeply with the guests and with one another. "Clara," Alexander said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "you came into my life when I didn't even realize how much I needed you. You've given me hope, laughter, and a reason to believe in the future again. Today, I promise to stand by your side through every challenge and every joy, for as long as we both shall live." Clara's voice trembled as she replied, "Alexander, you've shown me what it means to be seen, to be valued, and to be loved. You and Henry have given me a family I never thought I'd have. Today, I promise to love you, to support you, and to build a life with you that's full of hope and happiness." Henry sniffled loudly, earning a soft laugh from the crowd. The officiant smiled. "And now, The rings. Henry proudly stepped forward, holding out the small velvet box with a flourish. "I didn't lose them," he said, grinning. The crowd chuckled as Alexander and Clara exchanged rings, their hands trembling slightly with the weight of the moment. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the officiant declared. "You may kiss the bride." Alexander leaned in, his hands cupping Clara's face as he kissed her softly, their connection radiating through the gathered guests. The cheers and applause that followed seemed to echo across the gardens, filling the air with celebration. The reception was held on the estate's terrace, a joyful affair filled with laughter, music, and dancing. Henry, true to his word, ate more than his fair share of cupcakes and spent the evening darting between the guests, showing off his moves on the dance floor. Alexander and Clara shared their first dance to a soft, lilting melody, their steps slow and deliberate. For a moment, the rest of the world faded away, leaving only the two of them. "You're smiling," Clara teased, her voice low as they swayed together. Alexander raised an eyebrow. "Is that so surprising?" "A little," she admitted with a laugh. "You're usually so serious." "Well," he said, his voice softening, "you have a way of making me forget why I ever needed to be." Clara's heart swelled as she rested her head against his chest, letting herself bask in the happiness of the moment. As the evening wound down, Alexander took Clara's hand and led her to the edge of the garden. The guests were still dancing and laughing behind them, but the quiet of the night felt like their own little sanctuary. "Clara," he said, his voice low, "I've been waiting to tell you something." She looked up at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "What is it?" "I know this isn't just about us," he said. "It's about Henry, about building a life together that he can feel safe in. And I want you to know that I'll spend every day making sure you feel that same safety, that same love." Clara smiled, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "You already have." In the weeks that followed, the Moore household settled into a new rhythm. Clara took on the role of stepmother with a mixture of determination and tenderness, and Henry thrived under her care. Alexander, though still a man of measured words and quiet strength, began to open up more, his laughter becoming a more frequent sound in the house. As winter set in, the garden they had planted together lay dormant under a blanket of snow. But within the house, the warmth of their family grew stronger, a reminder that love and hope could flourish even in the harshest seasons. Beatrice, meanwhile, had been left to face the consequences of her schemes. Without Alexander's protection or influence, her social standing crumbled. Rumors of her manipulations spread quickly, and one by one, her connections severed ties. She left Boston quietly, a shadow of the woman who had once held court in its wealthiest circles. One evening, as the family sat together by the fire, Henry looked up from his book and smiled. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "this is the best Christmas ever." Clara and Alexander exchanged a glance, their hands intertwining. "Why's that, buddy?" Alexander asked. "Because we're all here," Henry said simply. "And it feels like home." Clara leaned over to kiss the top of his head. "It is home," she whispered. And for the first time in a long time, Alexander and Clara felt the truth of those words settle deep into their hearts. Together, they were more than a family. They were a new beginning, filled with love, resilience, and the promise of a bright future.